the growth that was sticking out. So we've done that before successfully, but the trick is to not take out big sections because you form a hole. We've done that once and the hole's virtually still there after probably 10 years.
Councillor Ford.
Councillor Davis.
My concern, I suppose, is about ongoing management of it. I think it would be very onerous to manage. My understanding is, there's fruit there, people step on it and there's an injury there. That's my primary concern. I suppose, what happens if you go away, or what happens if you become unwell, or something like that?
Yep, that's a good point. We would, the management agreement would require us to do it, so we would get somebody to do it.
Yeah. Well, I'd also like to thank you very much for coming to us with the proposal as well and doing the drawings. I think that's excellent.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your deputation.
Thank you.
Do you have a question?
At what stage was it posited that the tree might be removed? Because it wasn't my understanding that that was part of the management plan.
It wasn't until the order came through. An order's now been issued for either removal or cutting it back to the boundary, not to the tennis court fence line, but to the boundary. Okay. And when you look at the plan, that's half the tree, and it would fall over, so you wouldn't actually do that. You'd have to take the tree out.
Thank you. Thanks for your deputation.
Thank you. Oh.
You can.
There is. Thank you, Your Worship. Regarding the picture that we've all seen, the overhanging lower branches, I'm not talking about the canopy, but the lower branches, can't you possibly keep those pruned down so that they are a non-intrusive branch, lower branch on the tree? Has that been done, and is that possible to be done?
Yes, we do that now. We maintain 2.5 metres clearance over the lane now, so that occurs now, and that's below the fence line, so it's not of a concern to us. We're interested in maintaining the visual barrier of the upper part of the canopy. Thank you.
I've got a question. It's on.
Councillor Rossiter.
Thank you. You mentioned that you now sweep up the debris from the tree in the lane. That's correct, isn't it? What do you do with all the debris once you sweep it up?
We put it in the green bin.
In your own bin?
Yeah.
It's not just piled up in the lane and left.
Well, it was left until we both did it actually, but I left it in there for probably, I don't know, a couple of weeks, I suppose, and then when there was a row of berries, I'd go in with a shovel and put them in the green bin. Just before the green bin was emptied, and it gets emptied every 2 weeks. So,
right. Yeah. Thank you.
But they were all swept to one side, so they were out of the path of people walking through.
Thank you. Again.
Thank you.
And
thank you very much. Thank you very much for
that's a pleasure. Thank you.
accepting our deputation.
I asked Stephen Merritt to come forward on the matter of our parking policy.
Thank you. Stephen Merritt, Unit 2, Number 1, Almond Avenue, Glenside, and I'm here to speak to the changes in the parking policy that will see us losing both of our parking permits with no redress. The changes do not attempt a targeted solution to problems identified in some areas, but impose an indiscriminate blanket ruling across all the City of Burnside. Unlike neighbouring city councils who sought resident input regarding parking and do accommodate differing circumstances, the City of Burnside issued a fait accompli. My situation is we live in an early 70s, sort of 1.5 bedroom unit with a small garage, small courtyard and shared driveway. I've been a resident and ratepayer for over 30 years. We own a small car and bought a camper van following my retirement in January this year. We have a resident permit for both vehicles and through necessity park the camper van on the street. Justifications offered for changing the policy include the number of parking permits issued by council in some streets exceeds the number of parking spaces. In my street there are 14 spaces and only 2 vehicles that regularly use resident permits, including mine. At any time there are at least 12 parking spaces available to others. Despite these obvious differences, the blanket ruling treats the 2 situations as identical. The policy also treats all garages, all off-street parking and all vehicles as being identical and fails to acknowledge that real-life variations exist. At number 7 in my street, my neighbour's single vehicle garage is about 4 metres across and 6 metres deep. My garage is less than 2.5 metres across and 4.3 metres deep. Again, despite this variation, no difference in circumstances are acknowledged. My off-street parking is accessed at a 90-degree angle off a shared driveway. The area in front of the garage is shared with my neighbour, who parks his medium-sized car outside of their empty garage as it's too small for the car. At number 7, off-street parking is accessed directly from the street. Again, the difference in circumstances are not acknowledged and the 2 situations are treated as identical. Our small garage, due to lack of alternatives, is used to store away from the weather things like our bicycles, camping and fishing gear, gardening tools, portable camping fridge, stepladder, etc. My neighbour at number 7 is able to accommodate their car and still have more than enough space for all the items I store in my garage, and their garden area would easily accommodate a shed if they chose. Despite the obvious differences and justifiable need to safely store some common basic belongings, the blanket ruling acknowledges no differences in circumstances. Lifestyle opportunities are impacted, well-being disrupted, and we become collateral damage. Before buying the camper van, I inquired about my parking options directly with council staff, explained my situation and parking limitations. I was informed that I was entitled to 2 permits plus 1 transferable permit and bought the camper van on this basis. After making this lifestyle decision and financial commitment, I'm told that my parking options have been changed and no consideration of my circumstances will be given. Our blanket rulings with no resident engagement are much easier to implement than targeted solutions based on engagement and acceptance of differing circumstances. Expediency has resulted in a rigid, unjust policy where some residents' well-being is disrupted for circumstances that are beyond their control or simply do not apply to them. Unlike the City of West Torrens policy, it fails to acknowledge the real-life differences in living circumstances and unfairly disadvantages some residents. No resident engagement was sought, and the relevance of human costs and disrupted well-being completely dismissed. I would request the implementation of the parking policy be delayed and a more balanced policy developed that includes a meaningful attempt at resident engagement, aligns more closely with the City of West Torrens model by acknowledging and accommodating variations in resident living circumstances, includes an appeal process to allow residents' specific situation to be considered, and does not disadvantage those where no problem exists. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you. Are there any questions of Mr Merritt? Councillor Cornish.
Thank you. Just like to thank you very much for coming in and proposing all of those changes and raising the issues. It was very important for us to all hear. I thought your proposal regarding the City of West Torrens, did you do a lot of research on what other cities did?
I had a look. I discussed the changes that, or the way Unley went about changes with 2 close friends that live in Unley, and I had a look at the West Torrens, City of West Torrens website and read their policy and how it's implemented and the costs, as well as the agenda where this was discussed in February.
I have my own question of the administration rather than you, because I was interested to learn that we don't appear to look at individual cases. I thought we did. Can you clarify what our policy on that matter is?
Through the Chair, yes, certainly. The policy enables the administration to review individual circumstances and make an assessment whether off-street parking is available before it determines the number of permits that that resident can apply for. So in the case of Mr Merritt, although the process isn't in place as yet, one of our Rangers team did go along and visit and reviewed Mr Merritt's circumstances. And it was that decision that was upheld.
So what Mr Merritt is saying is that, as I hear it, is that his circumstances were reviewed unfairly because his off-street parking facilities are not as generous as may have been anticipated. That's, I presume, what you're saying.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Councillor Ford, did I see you with...
The matter that you've just discussed answers my question about, well, just to continue that theme, you know, what approach did you make to the council to have your circumstances considered?
Okay. My initial conversation was with reception staff and a request to speak to a ranger to try and understand how they were going to make their determinations. The reception staff said the ranger wasn't willing to have a conversation, but that I should write to my local council members asking that the fees be waived, and they were able to do that. So my initial response was to write to Councillor Lemon and Councillor Wilkins by email, putting a case that included this and also some other considerations regarding an elderly mother's visits. Councillor Lemon visited my home and 10 days, 2 weeks after that, a ranger visited, clearly unhappy to be there, offered the comment that if I trimmed a tree that was slightly overhanging my neighbour's driveway, that all the problems would be solved and I'd be able to park the camper van in front of the garage. It struck me as a rather simplistic and quite frankly bizarre suggestion.
Thank you for your deputation.
No, actually, it's not. Forget it. I need to ask the question later.
Okay, thank you.
So we have to debate.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Moving back to our agenda, we have no petitions. We have a question on notice from Councillor Ford, and the answer has been provided in writing to you. There were 3 motions on notice. Councillor Davey has withdrawn 11.2 and 11.3. And what remains is Councillor Cornish's motion on our parking policy, which is on page 9 of your agenda. And in essence, Councillor Cornish is moving a motion that rescinds the parking policy that we have just been discussing. And I will ask him to read, for the benefit of the gallery and those others watching, what his alternative proposal is. Your motion.
Thank you, Mayor Parkin. So yes, my motion is to rescind Part 2 and Part 3.2 of the previous council resolution that we passed on the 20th of February, which involved the parking policy and our endorsement of it. Going forward, it is that this council should reaffirm immediately the previous parking policy that we had in place, that the administration develops a parking policy revision strategy that will include involvement strategies from Council's own community engagement policy, its public consultation, and the strategy will review parking restrictions and parking permits and the parking permit scheme. That the current applications for permits will be assessed against the previous parking policy immediately prior to the 20th of February meeting, and that all permit holders will be notified of this resolution. So that's effectively my resolution, is that everyone who's applying right now gets assessed under the old system, and that we develop a strategy where we get to consult with residents about how we will go ahead and amend the parking policy. Now, if I can speak to it, and I'm in no illusions that this is going to be an uphill battle. The last time we voted on this, it was an 8-3 split in this chamber. Here are some of the comments that I've received over phone, email, and meeting with some residents over the recent time. Why have you done this? What is the need of it? Why are residents being penalised again? Is council recommending I remove my front garden and turn it into a car park? Why do I have to pay to park in front of my own home? We have 2-hour parking outside our home 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Without permits, friends and family can only visit us for 2 hours. I've had a pregnant friend get a parking ticket and they were only here for 2 hours and 15 minutes. The council is doing this to us again. Why is it needed? My elderly mother, who has dementia, comes to visit me and all she worries about is when she has to leave. My son works late shifts and parks in the street when he comes home in the early hours of the morning. He will have the temporary permit in his car and we can't give that to family and friends that visit. Why weren't we consulted with? So there's some of the concerns that have been raised, and as we've heard tonight with the deputation, we've heard another one where a blanket policy rule like this, and I understand that with more policies or all policies, you are not going to accommodate every individual out there. You just cannot. But I think this is probably disadvantaging more individuals and ratepayers than the previous policy, and it's not a better step. In the areas of Dulwich and Rose Park, there is a huge swag of parking restrictions that are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This is probably a little bit of an overflow from the Queen Victoria Hospital days, and there was a lot of parking there. So a lot of these people, residents living in this area, with their parking permits, take their cars out of their garages, out of their carports, out of their driveways, park them on the street, so friends and family can use their garages and carports and driveways to come and visit them, because 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it's only 2 hours and that's it. I've not been able to ascertain the real reasons for this serious policy change, let alone the $50, the costs. And I really want to know that, for me, I was not given... I've had no issues, as I said at the last council meeting, raised where, sure, there might be some streets where there are more permits issued than parks available on the street, but a lot of the times, as I said, it's a convenience factor. One of the cars in the family unit will probably be on the street, but they just don't know which one. And it's very hard for people to hand around passes and permits and all of that. I've got one lady who lost theirs. They had a loan car recently and forgot to take it out of the loan car when they returned it to the mechanic. And the mechanic threw the temporary permit away, and it took her half a day off work to come to council, sign a statutory declaration in front of a Justice of the Peace just to get another temporary permit. So I think the policy is very onerous on our residents and ratepayers. So let's not penalise residents and ratepayers anymore. Let's get the old policy back, and we'll move forward and look at how we can revise this for our residents in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cornish. I seek a seconder for the motion.
I'm very happy to support Councillor Cornish in this particular regard.
Councillor Wilkins, you'd like to speak?
I would indeed.
Thank you. You may second the motion.
As somebody who lives in a residential permit parking area in Eastwood, along with many neighbours, there are people who park in the street and park in their driveways if they can. As I previously mentioned, I and some others do not park in their driveways because of sheer convenience, that if you park out front, but then my car was vandalised after the last parking episode discussion we had at council. But there are others who have, as we have a narrow driveway and large car, people mover and station wagon to cater for our 4 growing children. and they think that, other people think that, and not only one, this would be considered more of a money-making scheme. I've always spoken against paying people, owners who are residents, paying the extra $50 charge for the second permit. Currently we have 2 permits if you need them, and a transferable. I always keep the transferable in my front hallway so that if anybody's coming to do work for me, they know it's there, can use it, so they don't get a parking fine. My children use it. I only have 1 permanent park. But we have families all throughout Eastwood, which is a residential parking zone all throughout. John Street is the problem, where more parks were issued than was necessary, because some people who are renting have 2 and 3 cars per house. And some, when they come home at night, as was in one of the articles in the paper, actually have to park in Hortfield Terrace because there are no on-street parks left in John Street at 11 at night when they come home from work. So there is a real issue. People are upset that they didn't have a chance to actually discuss this. They weren't consulted before we made the radical change. So I do ask you to support the rescinding of this previous motion from 20 February and reinstate the original one prior to 20 February. And let's go forward and review it and get something that will actually accommodate owners who live in the residence and need extra parking. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wilkins. The motion's been moved and seconded. Councillor Ford, you wish to speak on the matter?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. With some reluctance, I have come to the view that we do need to revisit this policy. I think, though, and previously I did support it. The reason I supported it was because I feel and am informed and see from first hand that businesses along Fullerton Road, parking around the hospital and various other places is under enormous parking pressure, and it's inevitable that this sort of parking problem will arise in the inner city areas and in some cases in regional and peripheral areas. So there's going to be a pressure on parking availability, and I think unfortunately residents who have been there for a long time and have had not faced this before do have to give it some consideration. I think, however, it's certainly come to my view, as Councillor Cornish mentioned, that there are idiosyncrasies, and as Mr Merritt explained, and I think we do need to have some very accommodating system of dealing with those idiosyncrasies, and the description that has just been provided I don't think was adequate. I think the cost, in my experience, hasn't really been an issue. It's $50 for 2 years. It's $25 for 2 years if people are card holders and pensioners. You know, when one considers you can't even park in David Jones car park for 2 hours for that sort of money. I think the cost, you know, hasn't really been a problem that's been presented to me in great numbers. The reason for the cost, as I saw it, was to encourage people to park in their own facilities where that is available, and to not have a cost. I didn't see it as a revenue-raising process for the council particularly. It basically covers the administration fees and perhaps then the reviews of individual cases and the like. So that hasn't been a pressing issue in my experience, but I do think we have enough concern generated in the community to ask that we revisit this, and also issues like the 24-hour parking zones in the vicinity of Fullerton Road, Alexandra Avenue and so on. I think that certainly needs review before we put this in place.
Thank you, Councillor Ford. Councillor Osterstock.
Thank you. Just a question, a couple of questions. Under this current policy that we've adopted, that the motion seeks to rescind, if I live in a permit zone and I have 3 members of my family who have 3 vehicles registered to them, how many permits am I eligible for?
Through the chair, everyone is eligible for one transferable permit, and from that point an assessment's made in terms of need.
So one or every household?
Every household is entitled to one transferable permit under the current policy. Beyond that, there's the potential for 1 or 2 additional fixed ones, but that's done on an as-needs basis. So in your scenario with the 3 vehicles, if there are 3 car parks, you don't get any more, but if there are less than 3 car parks, to the extent there's a difference, you're eligible to 1 or 2 additional fixed permits. So if you've only got 1 car park, in that scenario, you would get 2 additional, so 3 in total.
So if I've got 3 cars registered to my household, members of my household, and I've only physically got room for 1 car, I'll get 2 permits.
3 in total.
3 permits in total.
1 transferable plus the 2 fixed ones.
Pretty generous policy as far as I'm concerned. When residents who may feel aggrieved by the policy, can you explain to the Chamber what review rights that they have at their disposal?
The current policy doesn't have the review mechanism built into it. Beyond that, there's Section 270 of the Local Government Act, which speaks of reviews of council decisions, but there's no review mechanism built into the policy.
My understanding was that council officers would assess each individual, assess residents' households to determine their eligibility for permits. Is that not what occurs?
No, they would.
I beg your pardon?
They would.
They would?
But if the decision's made that no additional permits are available, there's no review beyond that. So there is an initial assessment made.
Yes.
And permits are either granted or not. But that's the end of the road after that first decision.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Councillor Lemon.
Yes, I speak against this motion, and I speak against this motion for a number of pragmatic reasons. In the first instance, we need to remember that car parking permits are only ever required in areas where you've got regulated parking. Where you've got regulated parking, what you've got is parking that is a scarce resource, which is why we have a permit system. This policy, and it's an updated policy that hasn't been updated for a while, and I actually think that administration has done an incredibly good job looking at our neighbouring inner city councils, and may I ask a question at this stage, is the City of West Torrens an inner rim council of administration? It is.
Yes.
Looked at the inner rim council's parking and picked the best of what they had in Norwood and in Unley and in Walkerville and incorporated this in what we had, which was a laissez-faire attitude to parking that had been going on for many years. What we need to be very clear about here is that no one will be disadvantaged. What will happen is, and what we're hearing, is that people are aggrieved because they're inconvenienced. When you look at some of the emails we've had over the last several weeks, and the good thing about Google Maps is you can go and have a look at these streets and you can see the commodious driveways that exist in those inner suburbs of Dulwich and Rose Park and Frueville and Eastwood. And you can see those houses that do have driveways People like to park in front of their house because they can't be bothered shifting their car to let their daughter go off to their job at any hour of the day. It's a convenience for residents. What we're doing, and I'll get to that point in a moment, is freeing up those spaces for those people that do need it, for those people that don't have off-street parking. What we need to ask ourselves is, what's the point of a road? Is the point of a road a parking lot? Or is the point of a road a carriageway? And the more cars you've got, and you just have to go, and Di says quite rightly, you just have to go down John Street or Elizabeth Street or Hortville Terrace, which is a wider road, and there's cars on them all the time. What we need to do is get those cars off the roads so that those streets can be used as carriageways, that those streets can be used for the purpose for which they were built, which is to take people from point A to point B. Which brings me to the other point. This isn't just about residents. Those streets are also provided for people that come to our city. So you want people to come to Burnside Village and go through a back road potentially to go to Sydney Street. You want people to actually use the businesses we've got on Fullerton Road. They won't be able to park on Fullerton Road. If you want to go and pay for your ambulance cover, you won't be able to park on Greenhill Road. It's Hortville Terrace for you, and you walk around the block if you want to go into the front door of the ambulance service. Is it up to us to actually make that easy for people to do from the rest of Adelaide? I can get in my car and I can drive around the inner city, and I can drive through Burnside, and I can drive through Norwood, where their council provides inner city streets, and I can drive through Walkerville, where their council provides inner city streets, and that's because councils actually work in unison to provide a network of roads for residents. We need to ask about the philosophy behind it. Because somebody's a resident, do we have to provide them free parking in front of their house? Is that an obligation when you're a resident of Burnside? Because it's certainly not an obligation in a lot of other councils. Is that what people expect of us? That they should be able to park their car in front of their house? Well, they can park their car in front of the house, and they can shift it every 2 hours, just like everybody else. No one's stopping them from parking their car. But they are the same as all the others, which brings me to my final point about consultation. Impossible to consult on this. How can we consult on the people that use our roads and use the car parks and park on our roads to use our businesses? How are we going to be able to consult with anyone except the residents? It is our job as a council to provide to the greater metropolitan area, as well as to provide in our network of roads, as well as to provide for residents. It's very easy to say, we're just going to rescind this policy because it's too hard, because too many people are actually complaining about it. I don't believe that's what leadership is about. Leadership is about making the right decision for the greater good of everyone that uses our road networks, not changing our minds because a number of people have actually complained. They complained last time when we changed our parking policy. Nobody complains about that now because people have got used to it. This is no different.
Thank you.
I will not be supporting it.
Thank you, Councillor Lemon. Councillor Monzo.
Thank you. Leadership is actually about taking people along on the journey and helping people to understand and making sure that people actually understand that they have had a say in that journey. They've had some discussion or input into the pathway or the travelling or the road that they're travelling. So, and we have consulted with businesses on Glen Osmond Road in relation to how much time that cars, the parking arrangements should be created outside of their businesses right on Glen Osmond Road. So we've done that. As I've listened to the debates from both sides, I think, number one, we should be involving the community, even if it is just the kind of comments that both Councillor Cornish and Councillor Ford have mentioned, the sorts of things that we've received as emails and phone calls. If people are upset and angry because they haven't even had a chance to actually have a say, I think we should be making sure that that happens. Because if people have had a chance to say, even if we think it's too hard and it's too complicated, there are always means of rationalising and looking at the feedback. But if you don't involve them, they get angrier. Secondly, we could create an appeals process. I now understand that under the current policy, or the one before the motion that was passed at last meeting, there was no appeals process as such, although there was negotiation. People could come and say, look, you know, I think I've been hard done by. But it seems to me like there needs to be work on this policy, that it's not, what was passed at the last meeting isn't complete. I wonder to what extent some of these streets that have 2-hour parking might actually now be analysed again and looked at whether or not they require 4-hour parking rather than 2. Which would ease the issue for residents when they do have visitors coming for lunch. And I do appreciate the issue of having elderly people come, and having had a period of disablement myself, I really appreciate and understand how important it is to be able to park, or at least drop-off zone, as convenient to the place that you are going, whether it be a business or a family outlet, as you possibly can park. So I think there's some problems here that haven't yet been resolved. And what does it really matter if we, why shouldn't we just take a bit more time and get it right? Give the people an opportunity to, instead of bleat at us, actually write on their comments, give feedback. I haven't had a lot of people complaining to me about the cost. It's been more about convenience, access, and issues to do with flexibility. So I think there is some more work to be done, and for that reason, I will be supporting this motion.
Thank you. And Councillor Ford, you have a question?
Oh, sorry.
Could I ask the administration, what would be the problem with having all of the permits transferable? Because that's certainly an issue that's come up many times to me.
I take it the question still in the context of the existing policy. There may not be a problem. That question I'd need to sort of take away on notice and think about a little bit. There may not be.
Thank you. Councillor Pickett.
Could I ask a question first? Through you, Mr Mayor. What is the mechanism, or is there any plan in regard to, there's been a couple of things come up tonight in regard to the 24 hours issue in Rose Park, perhaps the 2 should be 4, that sort of thing in key areas. Is there a mechanism for that to be revisited, planned, or?
Through the chair, yes, and that's something that's happening anyway, and independently of what happens tonight. So we've written to all the people close to Fullerton Road and Green Hill Road seeking their views about the adequateness of the current controls in their street. And without preempting what the results might be, a 24-hour control might disappear, be replaced by a day one.
Yeah.
But that's an ongoing thing that is occurring now, and
but that's in process now.
That's in train now.
Perhaps in 3 months' time, irrespective of what happens here, there may be moves afoot to change some of that stuff to make that different. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Can I, if I speak to the motion, I'm not in support of the rescission this motion either, or not either, but I'm not in support of it. I went back and revisited the report that we looked at when we first voted it in, and I also did review Mr Merritt's correspondence, and amongst others as well that have hit me. I'm a councillor of an outer suburb, I suppose, that doesn't have the same issues. I get that, but from a citywide point of view, I sort of feel that the policy has been brought in for the right reason. I'm not convinced that a widespread consultation would actually give us any more than what we've got here now. We've actually got a fair range of reasons and issues that need to be dealt with in regard to it. And a policy, by definition, needs to be across the city, and it will affect people in different ways. I think the issues for mine that where it's not quite right is certainly coming up with the fact that perhaps some of the requirements on the streets are not right. The 24-hour issue, that's clearly if that's not necessary, it's a real shame that it's in play. So that needs to be reviewed, which I've just been assured will be. I do feel that where the policy does miss is, and in Mr. Merritt's situation, was that the previous policy did have a mechanism for it to be that sort of catch-all, I suppose. Sort of the captain's call almost. I think it was referred to the CEO or a designate to look at if the rules of the game for some reason didn't quite fit specifically. Now that's going to happen all over the city, and you wouldn't necessarily break the rules and do it, but I think there does need to be a mechanism that allows that to be looked at a higher level outside the formal review of it. I feel that we should, and I assume that given that it's a rescission motion, we can't do that tonight, but I feel what we should do is take the current policy and actually include again that wicket-keeper, if you like, that actually has a look at specific issues if they are brought up by a resident, brought up by someone like Mr. Merritt. I think that's what it needs. Otherwise, I think it's actually in for a good reason. It's been well researched. There's no question that there are issues currently where we've got too many permits and not enough spaces. The way the world's going in regard to the building of dwellings in the inner city, it's only going to get worse. So it is right that the City of Burnside brings in a policy that is more along these lines. And I do feel that if we had a mechanism that could perhaps try and at least hear the issues, if not give them what they want, that would allow the wider good to be gained by the fact that we would have a policy that would work much to the betterment of the city in regard to managing our parking, and particularly in a city. So I would propose that we don't accept the rescission that's been proposed by Councillor Cornish, but we do, if I can do it tonight, that's great, but we do at some point add a further clause to the policy that allows someone like Mr. Merritt to apply for it to be looked at as a special case by council, and allow that second phase to actually at least address some of those issues. So I feel we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We should push on.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A question, and I take on board Councillor Piggott's contribution. I've just been having a look at our policies, and my understanding is that a resident aggrieved by a decision of council has the ability to raise that grievance with council administration, and that would be managed under our complaints handling policy. If I'm correct, can you explain how the complaints handling policy would interact with grievances raised by residents in relation to this proposed policy?
Through the Mayor, yes, you're correct, Councillor Rosterstock. Section 6.49 of the parking policy actually makes reference to any other disputes or complaints relating to decisions made under the policy, other than a decision to issue expiation notices, may be dealt through the complaint handling policy, including review under Section 270 of the Local Government Act. The complaints handling policy essentially restarts the process. It provides me as the principal officer of the organisation with the facts based around the complaint and the evidence provided by the administration, and then I make a determination on that particular matter. Sorry, someone else is first.
Just clarify, CEO, please. From what you have told me, I was, in the first instance, going to advise Councillor Piggott that in the event that this motion was unsuccessful, that I would allow him to run a motion that may put that rider of a review policy on our existing policy, but you have now told me that's not necessary.
Through you, Mayor, that's correct. It's actually embedded in the parking policy under 6.49.
Thank you. Councillor Bills.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, could I just move on? It's irrelevant to that issue, but I'll wait.
You will give an opportunity. Councillor Bills.
Thank you. I wasn't at the meeting on the 20th, so I didn't really hear the debate or what was discussed, but I'm just wondering whether most of the parking issues and the complaints that have come in and the way we're addressing it is in that western end of the city, close to the city of Adelaide. Is that due to an increase in people from outside coming in and parking and riding, creating difficulties for local residents to actually access spots? Has that got something to do with it?
Is that a question of the administration?
That's a question of the administration.
Well, through me, the answer is partly yes. It is not only the western end, it is around the hotspots, which would be the Burnside Hospital, Burnside Village, our various outlying retail centres, but predominantly the inner suburban, Eastwood, bit of Glenunga, Dulwich, Rose Park would be the main areas which we're dealing.
Okay, to continue on, I've always gone along with the adage that those who pay have a say, and I think with some of the conversations that have been had around this table tonight, that the residents who are affected in those areas do have a right to express an opinion, and I'll leave that there. Another question. From what I understand of the current policy, the one that we're trying to rescind tonight, is that this is a council-wide and that could actually be implemented in any street, in any suburb, irrespective of location, proximity to the city or volume of traffic. Is that correct?
That is correct. People can apply for permits in any street, but they're unlikely to apply for them if they don't need them.
That's why I'll support the motion, because I don't think if we've got a problem in area A, then others living in B to Z need to be potentially affected by a policy which would include them. So I will be voting with the rescission motion, because I think it's sensible that we go back and just have a look at and thrash out and resolve some of the minor issues, but ones that are very, very important and relative to this situation. So I will be supporting the motion.
Thank you. And Councillor Davis.
Thank you. I think this is a very complicated issue, and I think primarily it's made worse because there are different areas, but I think Councillor Lemon is very right when she says that the whole point of this the whole point of these parking restrictions is to address scarcity. And for example, on Grant Avenue, there are 71 car parking spaces, but there's 108 permits. On Alexandra Avenue, there's 114 spaces, but only 97 permits. Dulwich Avenue, 80 parking spaces and 102 permits. So there are more permits issued than there are car parking spaces. And for me, the biggest concern is, yeah, you have a potentially a right to park outside your house. Sure, I'm not sure if it's a right, but perhaps that should be made available to you. But what about the next door neighbour's house? And what about the one in front of theirs? Do they have then an equal right that you say you have to park outside your house? What about the person next door? And so where there are more cars for a household than there are car parking spaces available out the front and on land than what they, on their actual property, then what they do is they move next door. And so they infringe on somebody else's. So I think that's one of the main concerns I have, and what I think this policy does address is to say that you're creating a more equitable system where you're only allowed to occupy per household a certain area of the space. And I think that is an equitable approach to dealing with this problem of scarcity. I don't think we've got it right though. And I think there needs to be more work done. I think a good solution would be to make them all transferable permits. That would stop a lot of the issues that I've seen of this shuffling that you see where cars are moving in and out because some are temporary and some are permanent. So I think make them all transferable, and what that's going to do is then limit that person to utilise or encourage them to utilise their household parking where they can, and then where it's more convenient to give it to somebody else. But I still accept that it's difficult to shuffle them around if that's the case. But I think making them all transferable permits would go a ways to fixing that. So I think in terms of this rescission motion, what I don't think is a good idea is to move this rescission motion and abandon the policy that we have now. We put it in because it addresses a need, and it doesn't apply to all areas. It only applies where there are parking restrictions. It doesn't apply to Penfold Road because you don't need a parking restriction there. It's only where there are areas already being identified as areas of need where there does require. So it is localised and targeted in many ways to those areas where you do have that 2-hour parking limit. So for example, at the showgrounds or whatever in Unley is a good example where it's 2-3 hour parking everywhere so that people can't go to the show or for the entire time. So I can see that there is certainly a need for it, and also places where there are not enough spaces. The other thing is, I suppose we're looking at things like Glenside and those developments, and what happens when they don't put in appropriate car parking. Are they now and they build the streets so small so that you can't get they say, I'm entitled to park outside my house. But what happens is he's entitled to, on this side of the street, to park outside the front of their house, and they're entitled to park on the outside. And Councillor Piggott and I have run into problems on Pepper Street where we couldn't get through because two people have parked next to each other and there was no way to get through. So there's certainly problems there, and I think there is a need. And I don't see that you have a right to park outside the front of your house. If we can accommodate that, fantastic, especially in older houses where they don't have on-street parking. And that's another variation which I find it very difficult. But in terms of this rescission motion, I don't think we should rescind it. I think we should look at where there are problems and change our policy and amend it to see if it can work, rather than rescind the entire thing. Because what that will mean is that our residents have just gone through this process, they've just been educated on it. Now we're going to rescind it, go back to the old system, which we then need to communicate to them, and then go through a review system, then put in a new system that they now need to understand. I think far better and far clearer to say, let's see what we can do to improve it. And I think starting with transferable permits would be a good start. That would stop the shuffle. And if push comes to shove and it is unworkable, then let's go back. But I think it should be a slow improvement. I think that there are things that are wrong. I don't think it's working as intended, but that is to be expected. And the only way we can really find out these things is to, in some cases, suck it and see. I suppose we certainly could have avoided it. But we're here now, and I think that we should try to improve the policy we have to see if we can make it work, rather than confuse residents no end and probably set it back another year and a half and then go through 2 more processes of informing them what the current restrictions are. So far better to take on their feedback now and improve it as we go.
Thank you, Councillor Davis. I need to point out that no way, anywhere in Burnside, anywhere in Australia, do anyone have an entitlement to park outside their own house. It's entirely unenforceable. What the restrictions as a scarcity issue are meant to do is give you a much better chance of parking close to your house. If they weren't there, you couldn't. What the restrictions are actually for the benefits entirely of residents. It is just a matter of what the best way of making it work is. Councillor Osterstock.
Thank you. I won't be supporting the rescission motion. I think it's the wrong way to go, and in my view it's poor governance. The policy that the motion seeks to rescind, in my view, the current policy represents a better balance between the competing interests in relation to on-street parking, and it's a fair system. Certainly better than the old system. That's why we enacted this policy. And the current rescission motion is in effect turning back time, and we're going back to a bad system. And that's not right. Everyone in a street with restrictions still gets one free transferable permit. Beyond that, permits are issued on a merit system, where the residents that need them get them. It's based on need. Residents who have ample off-street parking don't get access to extra permits because they don't need them. It's not about personal convenience, it's about introducing a fair system for all. It's a more efficient system in that a permit under this system lasts for 2 years, as was pointed out by Councillor Ford, instead of 1. And the cost of additional permits is a fair price, as pointed out by Councillor Ford, to compensate for administrative work involved in the maintenance of the scheme. And to date, councillors, after this policy has been widely disseminated in the media and on our website, councils received 40 complaints out of 1,200 residents within the affected zones. If we rescind this policy, which in my view we shouldn't, we run the risk of reputational risk, as we as a council have strenuously defended our decision in the media, with the community, on our website and via e-news. Could also result in future pressure on the Chamber in regard to all decisions that we make, that a minority of opinion can influence the decision making on a policy that is now fair and equitable for all residents. And this a rescission could place the next council in an uncomfortable position in making the decision, or to delay the decision if this rescission motion gets up. Councillors, this is the right policy at this point in time, and like all policies, can be amended, can be tweaked, as the case may be. And to do that requires an elected member bringing a motion to the council, calling on the administration to see whether or not all permits being classed as transferable is a workable proposition, and if the answer is yes, the policy is amended to reflect as such. There was much talk about no right of review for a resident that may feel that they're aggrieved by the policy. Well, we've learnt tonight that inbuilt into the policy is such a right of review, and that is been articulated by the CEO with reference to our complaint handling procedure. So to throw this policy away and go back to the bad old policy is not the right way to go. It is poor governance. This motion should be defeated, and let's stick with the policy as been previously endorsed by the council, and if it needs amendment, we'll amend it in the future.
Councillor Piggott, do you have a question?
I do. Just coming back to the issue around the complaints handling process, could I just ask, would it be fair to say my understanding of complaints handling is that it would go back to the start of the process, it would be reviewed in terms of the decision, but if the decision was still consistent with the policy, then the decision would be reaffirmed and the answer would still be the same? Does that make sense?
Through the Mayor, not necessarily, because the policy says that there are circumstances where the policy can be waived or different aspects of it dealt with. So in any review situation, it would be my assessment versus the assessment of the officer making the decision in the first place. So if a particular officer said that an additional parking permit wasn't warranted because there was sufficient space on site, and I had a different view, then I could say a permit will be granted. So if it simply doesn't meet the policy, that the answer isn't an automatic no or an automatic yes. So I have a discretion, and that's what the complaint handling process requires me to have, is a separate discretion.
Could I ask one further question then, along the same lines, and if I could take you back to the old policy in 626, and it's, if someone wants to look it up, it's on page 105 of the February 20 agenda. And it reads, an eligible applicant can request additional fixed residential parking permits. Any additional permits above those provided in 625 may be granted after an assessment of individual circumstance and with approval by the Chief Executive Officer or an authorised delegate. My question there is, would it be fair to say that introduces a higher level of discretion in respect to reviewing the situation that the complaints handling process provides, in that it actually doesn't say yes or no whether the previous decision was correct, but it does actually allow individual circumstance to come in at the discretion of the CEO or whoever he puts in charge of this to actually do that.
Through the Mayor, I think that's a failing in the former policy, that discretion is inbuilt into the policy itself. I think the policy that Council has adopted, which refers a complaint to the complaint handling policy, is a more governance-orientated way of dealing with the complaint, rather than including a discretion in the policy itself, because I suspect that prior to any decision being made under the former policy, if there was a grievance, it would automatically be escalated to me, as opposed to going through a formal grievance process through the complaint handling policy.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Davey.
Thank you, Your Worship. I've got a couple of questions to start off with. We've got 45,000 plus residents in Burnside. I can't see anywhere close at hand any figures for how many residences we have and how many businesses. Does anyone know approximately, just to get an idea of the extent of
My understanding is
coverage?
we have about between 20 and 21,000 residences or properties which pays rates.
And businesses, does anyone know? Without wanting to put anyone on the spot. But
I don't know the answer to that.
anyway, my point is, I'll speak now to the motion. I don't support this motion. I understand the intent of it, and I thank Councillor Cornish for raising it. But I think basically we have duly considered this in February and beforehand when it was circulated to us all for our input and comment. I think this is basically a sound policy, and it does address a very complex and quite widespread issue equitably. I agree there could be some tweaking of it and of how we manage it, but and I think too that it would be better if the permits could be transferable. But we have such a huge range of homes, units, flats, businesses across the huge range of street sizes and suburbs, old and new in Burnside, that we really need a flexible policy like this one that has been produced. We need to ensure the residents who do have, or businesses who do have problems, are listened to, and that a solution is worked through to address individual issues. We need to ensure our staff are well trained and positioned to do this and to work with our residents and business owners. But I agree that this is the fairest system that we can put in place at this moment, and that in the interests of good governance we should maintain and improve, if necessary, this well thought through version. So I think we should implement this one and see how we can support our people through it, implementing it. But it's the best way to go in managing a very complex issue across such a complex range of residents and businesses.
Thank you. And Councillor Ford, do you have a question?
Yes, I do, Your Worship. Could I ask, in the light of this policy having been circulating for several months, and in the light of feedback that some of which we've provided tonight, I mean, what would be the minimum time that it would take to tweak it, as has been said, receive, perhaps a 30-day period of feedback, and then further submit it to council?
Through the chair, I'm just grappling with the question a little bit, but some of the issues, the consultation policy requires us to consult for a minimum of 21 days. And in order to prepare a consultation package, and we need to put some, if we are going to consult with the community, we need to understand a few questions. Who are we going to consult with? Are we consulting just with permit holders? Are we consulting with businesses as well? What are some of the key things that we're going to be asking them? It'd be difficult to see a new policy or a revised policy prior to caretaker. Is a first cut answer to that question.
Through the chair, if I could also add to that, our current consultation policy and the Act doesn't actually require us to consult on this particular issue. We've already checked that out. So what we would have to do, to answer your question, Councillor Ford, is to redo the process that we did leading up to the presentation of the new policy to Council. So that would be working through possible amendments with some feedback from the elected members, presenting a revised draft to the elected members, and we generally run that on a couple of weeks turnaround through an infodoc, and then at the next available council meeting that would be represented. So that would be the process that we would do to accompany the tweaks that are being proposed.
I'll ask my further question on that. It's been an interesting debate, and it has been a range of views, but on balance, there appears to be a general wish to improve what we currently do, but concern that what we are proposing to do doesn't quite go far enough or doesn't tweak enough. If this motion were, the rescission motion was lost, and I allowed a motion to be run by, if an elected member chose to do so, which asked the administration to take the policy as it now stands and to add X, Y and Z to it and to bring it back to this chamber for consideration in 3 weeks, whatever, is that a possible scenario?
Through the Mayor, yes, that's certainly a possible scenario. I would suggest, though, that the council not be explicit in terms of what it recommends that we include as tweaks, because at this point in time, what's been suggested around the table may not in fact be beneficial. The notion of having all transferable permits may in fact not be the best outcome, and there's a reason why we have in fact limited transferable permits to 1 and having fixed permits. We haven't clearly been able to explain that to you, but rather than simply saying that's the solution, that's the silver bullet, I'd recommend that we come back to you with what we believe are appropriate tweaks, rather than the council actually specifying them, and we could do that within 4 weeks.
So would you require a motion to that effect, or would you do it anyway?
With all, through you, Mayor, all policies have a review process, so we would be reviewing the policy in any event in 12 months' time, but certainly we've taken on board the feedback that we've received, and the fact that you're having this debate in the chamber tonight. So if you wish, we can be instructed via resolution, but if that's not the case, we would endeavour to get a policy paper to you within 4 weeks.
Then all I can do is suggest to the chamber that if you choose to vote this motion down, the rescission motion, then I will accept the motion from the floor, which asks for a policy review as a matter of urgency, as outlined by the CEO. Councillor Davis, you have a question?
Yeah, just to clarify, the CEO said we could certainly specify certain things that we're particularly interested in. So we could say we ask the administration to consider transferable permits, and then you can come back with the thing. And also, would it be possible to look at that fee? Is the fee there to cover administrative costs at the moment? So it'd be possible to consider not having that fee as well as part of that policy. I don't know the answer to that.
Through the Mayor, yes, certainly that's the case, but the The anticipated fees that would be generated are also included in the draft fees and charges schedule that is part of the annual business plan and budget, so that would have an impact on the budget.
Councillor Monceau.
I just have a question, and that relates, it follows on from what Councillor Davis has said, and that relates to the question of parking zones. And I would like to see the consideration of the review of the parking zones being implemented into a report that we receive, because I do think that aspects of that can have an impact on people's requirements for parking. Yeah, no, I appreciate they're doing that already. They said that they were doing it already, but I would like that to be part of the report that comes back, if it's possible to be considered, because I think the two things affect each other.
Councillor Bills.
Through the Mayor, that's a bigger body of work. And while we are doing it at the moment, if the council wants a report on that, we won't be able to do that within 4 weeks.
Not on the whole thing, no.
Not in terms of parking zones.
Councillor Bills.
Yeah, just a question to the CEO, and I'm interested in in your comments there. If we move this motion asking you to review something, doesn't that then take away the impact of the current policy which is in place, or can it be done in concert with it? Because it sounds like you're taking this bit and taking it, got to put more stuff in. So if that's the case, isn't that current policy non-effective because we've actually moved a motion to do something else to it? That's my question.
Through the Mayor, it depends on how the motion is actually crafted, but I'm assuming that the substantive council policy that comes into effect on the 1st of July is in place, and what the council would be asking us is to provide information as to how that policy could be improved. We will provide you with that report in 4 weeks' time, and if you think the improvements that we're recommending are of benefit, then we would make the necessary changes to the policy at that point in time. But it doesn't affect the current policy as of today.
What about the aspect of the $50 for other permits? Will that still be applicable whilst you're going through this process? That's another consideration.
Through the Mayor, yes, it would, unless there's a specific resolution to the contrary. Yes.
Councillor Davis, a question again.
If it was later determined that, for example, there would be no fee involved, perhaps for whatever reason, could the council order to refund those fees, for example?
I think that's a matter of detail that's not an issue we can talk about. Anything's possible. Councillor Lemon, you have a question?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
Through the Mayor, that would be a logistical nightmare. And if the council is of a view to not charge fees, I'd rather the decision be made not to do that, rather than charge fees and then seek to provide reimbursement.
Councillor Lemon?
Yes, I've just had a quick look at my calendar, and if you're coming back to us in 4 weeks' time, that will be the 28th of June. The policy that we're talking about won't take effect till the 1st of July. So any decisions we make on that night of the 28th of June will immediately, if we're not charging fees, you would know before the 1st of July that we're not charging fees.
That's
Is
right.
that...
Okay, debate's over.
No, I'm just asking, through you, Your Worship, I'm asking, would that be early enough for them not to charge fees if we decided at the 28th of June meeting?
Okay, well, let's get an answer.
Through the chair, no.
It's not enough time?
No, even though the new permits will take effect from the 1st of July, the assessment and application process is beginning now.
Yeah.
Once you started all this, you may sum up.
Thank you, Mayor Parkin. And look, thank you every councillor here. It's been a great debate about the issue, and I thank you all for your input. Just a few things I will in my rebuttal. Need to free up streets for people who need them. Well, we've only ever really had one street that's actually been an issue. All the other streets, although there were a number that, once again, more permits than parks, were not overly used. People could still find parks on them. So I kind of sort of shoot that one down. In terms of following what our neighbouring councils do. Well, only a couple of meetings ago we said, well, differential rating for businesses. We're Burnside, we're different. We shouldn't follow what our neighbouring councils do, even though Unley has a 173% increase on their commercial rates than Burnside, according to the paper. And the 24/7 restrictions being revised right now, and I'd probably say that this was highlighted because of the parking permits. People actually said, well, hang on, if I lose my permits, no one's going to be able to visit me. We need to provide this sort of thing. So I think, a lot of these things we probably should have thought about a little bit beforehand, and the impact of people if we were to have changed this back in February. And the communication, it's a big issue. I hear, I do hear it and I do comprehend it, and I don't want this council to look like an idiotic body changing their minds and flip-flopping on decisions. It is probably the greatest concern out of all of them, but that was raised. But I certainly think, though, that we're here to represent the community. The community, and certainly my neck of the woods, has loudly spoken. They don't like these changes. They think that we are not supportive of residents in the areas anymore. And I'd just like you to consider that when voting. So I'll end the speech now. I do hope you do support it. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now put the rescission motion. All those in favour? Those against? The motion is lost. Division is called by Councillor Wilkins. All those in favour, please stand. Those in favour are Councillors Monso, Bills, Wilkins, Lord and Cornish. Those against are Councillors Osterstock, Lemon, Davis, Piggott, Davey and Ford. The motion is lost. However, if anyone wishes to run a motion, they are most welcome. Councillor Piggott?
Yep, can I have a crack at it? Can I, so one, that administration provide a report reviewing the parking policy, including but not limited to issues raised by the community and during the council debate. And during the council debates, comma, consideration of all permits being transferable and appropriateness of fees for permits. And two, that administration provide advice in respect to appropriate changes to be considered by council at its, what's the last June meeting? 28th of June meeting.
Thank you. I will now read that so we all can all clear of it. That the administration provide a report reviewing our parking policy, including but not limited to issues raised by the community and during the council debates. Consideration of all permits being transferable and appropriateness of fees for permits. And two, that the administration provide advice in respect to appropriate changes to be considered by council at its meeting scheduled for 28th of June 2018. 26th of June it is, if I'm told. Councillor Piggott, this has been debated extensively. I assume you can limit your concepts to pertinent comments.
There's not much more to add to that. I just tried to pick up. I mean, basically what we're asking is that everything you've heard from all sorts of sources, put that back in the pot and tell us what we perhaps may need to do on the 26th of June. In regard to the appropriateness of fees, I do accept that in terms of it's being done now. So if that decision was to change going forward, it may need to be a 12-month down the track or whatever. But I think it is worthy of inclusion in the exercise for the end of June. So yeah, I can't add much more.
Councillor Davis, you wish to second the motion?
Yes, I'm happy to second that. I think this is an appropriate second option. So I think, the council has said that we're not going to rescind it, but I think it makes sense for everyone to support this now, that this is the next alternatives to go through and consider it. So I think this is
Does
a
anyone
measure
have
appropriate.
anything to add that hasn't been debated before? Councillor Davey, no? No, there's no one further debate? Then I will put that motion. All those in favour? Against? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. And a good debate by all. Thank you. I will keep going. We move now on to the... where's my agenda gone? Agenda somewhere there. Move out onto the reports of officers. And, oh, sorry, no we don't. We've still got are there any questions without notice? There are no proposed motions without notice, so we move on to reports of officers, and we have 5, an unusually small number for us. The first, and please signify if anyone wishes to pull the matter for debate. The first is the third quarter budget update. Councillor Ford. The second is the regional subsidiary financial results. It has not been pulled, so I can have a motion in accordance with the officer's recommendation. Move Councillor Cornish, seconded Councillor Davey. All those in favour? Against? That's carried. The third is a partial, Councillor Davis, you are moving the partial waiver of an encumbrance at 5 Wilson Court, Rosalind Park. You're pulling it? Yes, you're pulling it. I'm only reading it out for the benefit of our watchers. 14.4 Macbeath Drive Sky, Councillor Pickett, which is a proposed road exchange and local government boundary realignment. And the 5th Conningham Street, Glenside, Councillor Lemon, you will pull the matter of our proposed master plan for that site. So we move back to 14.1. Councillor Ford, you have pulled the third quarter budget update, which begins on page 15 of our agenda.
Thank you, Worship. Well, I support the motion as it stands with the addition of a point 4, which I'd like to propose.
Yes.
And the point 4 would be that Council requests administration to provide a report on the effect of paying an additional $1 million in long-term debt reduction in addition to the budgeted loan repayment for 2017-18 by the next meeting.
You'll need to read that again just so we can go.
And to pay it during this financial year?
Yes.
Is that? Okay, understand. So your motion is, there is a substantial motion before us now, which has 3 tranches. You're adding a 4th tranche, which says that in addition to that, Council requests administration to provide a report on the effect of paying an additional $1 million in long-term debt reduction in this current financial year, in addition to our budgeted repayment.
Yes, but I would like to add that it be a report provided at the next meeting of Council.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
It's just 3 weeks. You don't give them a lot of time, but I also don't believe it would be a difficult report to write.
Shouldn't think.
Thank you. Willett Karishma.
Through the chair, there will have to be some modelling done, just just looking at that request, there is a difference between surplus and cash available. So while in the Q3 we are stating that the surplus will be $1.3 million, not all of that is necessarily cash available to repay debts, because there are some non-cash items in there as well. So I'll have to do some modelling and get back to you, but we could potentially have a look at that.
It may well have a serious cash deficit issue, but then again, it may well be something we can accommodate. That's the point. Yeah.
I will have to consider all of those variables. The other issue also is a lot of our payments, especially for capital projects, the payments come through end of the year, whereas the rates the last quarter is due 1st of June. So during the last month in June, there's always a bit of a cash deficit because of the timings of the rate payments and the timings of the contractor payments. So I'll have to forecast the timings of all the cash flows and then work out if we will be in a position to pay the $1 million in 17-18, given there's only 1 month left.
Are you saying that it cannot be done in the time frame?
I'm saying the report can be done.
Yes.
But whether we can physically pay the amount or not, that depends.
The report may say you can't do it. That's the point.
Yes.
At least you'll have a report.
I'll have
Thank
the
you.
report.
Councillor Ford.
Thank you, Worship. Well, again, I think what we're seeing is considerable flexibility, let's say, in our budgeting and our annual financial performance. And, we're seeing considerable revision at each quarter. And, I accept that this position that has developed here requires expenditures that are deferred, basically, but there are fundamental savings as well. Operating income net decrease of 115,000, and I think there's other opportunity in here to make a substantial contribution to our debt reduction. Bearing in mind particularly that the budget proposal for next year is dependent on borrowing in excess of a further $3.9 million, and we are rapidly approaching a point where we will have net financial liabilities ratio of towards 50%, which for a council that's not an expanding council, that doesn't have opportunity for great increase in its revenue, then I think we seriously need to address our borrowing. So I urge you to assist the process. Thank you.
The motion, move. I have a seconder of this motion.
I have a question.
I need a seconder first, please.
Seconder.
Thank you, Councillor Osterstock.
I don't wish to speak to it.
Thank you.
I have a question. In terms of, we have two accounts. We have a long-term loan account. We have a shorter-term redraw facility, essentially. So that's the CAD is a smaller system, yeah. So if we were to take, the CAD is the. CAD is the short term. Yeah,
Can
that's
you,
right.
Karishma, turn it on, please. Thank you.
Sorry, through the chair. Yes, we've got 3 facilities, so 2 long-term ones.
Yep.
One is for 2 million, another one is for 3 million. Both of them are for 15-year terms, currently in the 2nd and 3rd year. And the third facility is the $10 million facility, which is a CAD facility.
Okay. And the interest rates on those, my assumption would be the longer term has a lower interest rate.
Through the chair, I'll have to double check, but normally the longer the term, the better your interest rates, although the short-term facility would have variable interest rates, which which will work in line with the market.
So, yeah. So in terms of paying, say if we had $1 million cash in the bank, we have the option to pay it into a short-term facility or pay it against a long-term loan. And so either way, it's going to be put into one of those. Like if the administration has a spare $1 million cash sitting around, it sits in our offset account or our terminal offset account. That's what I'm familiar with, right? Rather than putting it into my actual mortgage repayment. Is that?
Through the chair, the way administration uses the cash ins and outs is exactly how you said. So if we require an amount of money for suppliers or payroll, we withdraw it from the CAD facility. And when we get excess, say, rates payments, we put it back in there.
Yep.
So it's drawing down and putting back as needed. With the other long-term loans, we pay in line with our payment schedule, which is quarterly principal and interest.
So does this motion simply result in taking potentially $1 million out of our short-term facility and putting it into our long-term facility?
Through the chair, that's correct. That would, however, mean that we have $1 million less flexibility to pay our suppliers and employees. The other point of concern is in our mid-year budget statements, our borrowing position at the end of the year was 16.6 million, which will reduce because of the Q3 adjustments by about 500,000. So as at Q3, the expected forecast debt position is $15.7 million, whereas our loan facilities are only $15 million, the 10, 2, and 3. So at this point, I cannot see an extra $1 million. We will be using, the timings of the receipts and the payments to manage that into next year. But at this point, I can't see the extra $1 million available to be paid into the long-term loan.
And I just had one final question. My understanding was that the audit committee considered the amount of the facility that the council would need to operate. So what would be its variance in its day-to-day living expenses, I suppose. And this council set that value based on what you would need. So would that impact, would moving 1 million from one account to another account, would that change what the audit committee and this council decided in terms of your requirements for day-to-day cash payments?
Through the chair, just reiterating, I think I understand what you're saying. Yeah. So 2 years ago, when we needed the additional loan, the audit committee endorsed us getting the second $3 million loan in order to be able to fund our operations and capital projects. So at that stage, the audit committee was quite comfortable with that and said we would need the $15 million to operate. So moving the money around, if available, would not affect that decision. The other item that the audit committee recommended was the debt-to-income ratio, and that's the target was 50%, or the upper limit was 50%. At the moment, we're sitting at about 30%, and it's projected for 34% next year. So that would reduce it if we pay off debt by $1 million.
Cool. I'd like to speak to it now. I'm going to speak against this motion, and for the basic reason is that I think that the administration have better things to be doing right now in terms of the budget season also coming up to June 30. And from what I can see is it's not reducing the amount of debt that we have. Because if we do have operating cash, or if we do have a surplus, then that goes and sits in that short-term facility anyway. So essentially what I'd be doing, so for my own personal circumstances, for example, I have an offset account and then I have a mortgage. And my offset account has all of my savings, and then I pay the minimum amount into my long-term because that has a better interest rate. So generally a shorter-term facility has a better interest rate, and the reason why I would go into a long-term facility is because it has that interest rate and we want to lock it in. And I think there was discussions in this council chamber about locking in more money into that long-term facility because it did have a really good interest rate. And so the question was, and I think we actually had discussion about predicting interest rate in futures and saying, well, are we thinking it's going to go up? I don't think it is because RBA is saying things aren't good. But looking at potential longer-term interest rate. So in my mind, we should leave it where it is, and we should continue to make our payments on our long-term debt and leave our facility where it is. There is, in terms of liquidity, what you're doing in terms of your mortgage is taking your offset account money and putting it into your mortgage. You still essentially pay the same amount of interest. There's not going to be a large difference between the two of them. However, what you're doing is just reducing your flexibility for absolutely no gain. Now, I'm happy to look at it, but I think you'll find that the interest rate's probably worse off, and we're just better off leaving it. We're better off paying down our short-term loans rather than our long-term loans, and leaving our long-term loans alone and giving ourselves the operational flexibility in terms of cash where it is. So for that reason, I'd oppose this motion.
I presume, Councillor,
well, this amendment.
That addition to the motion, that addition to the original motion is what you're opposing. Thank you. Councillor Piggott.
Thanks. And look, I do too. I don't think number 4 does anything for us apart from reinforce Councillor Ford's quest that that debt is an issue, which he's quite entitled to. But this actually doesn't really address that issue. What it does do is, as Councillor Davis pointed out, in a flurry before the end of the year, it's actually move $1 million from one spot to another spot. The amount we owe at the end of 30th of June, forget me, perhaps if we do gets up, this report might tell me different, but I suspect, irrespective of whether we do this, we will owe the same amount of money at the end of June as to whether we don't. And so I don't think it's of any merit at all, apart from reinforcing the issue, which, as I say, Councillor Ford's quite entitled to. He's done it at a time where we're actually looking at a report where clearly the actions of the council are very much in support of where he's going. We are looking at a third quarter review that shows considerable savings against the budget, considerable number of initiatives that have actually saved money of council. It's showing a number of projects that have been put into next year, a number of others that have actually had savings against what it cost us to do. We've got a report later on that shows a couple of other projects that were perhaps going to be done next year, potentially going to be pushed into the following year. The actual report very much fits with where Councillor Ford wants to take us in terms of reducing debt. Now, you've probably heard me before. I don't feel his concerns, and we heard tonight about where our net liability ratio sits. It sits in the 30s. It's not knocking on the door of 50. This will certainly help that also. So the council's actually in really good shape, and this report is evidence that the need to keep a lid on spending, both operating and capital, is very much at the front of the mind of administration here at the moment. So to that end, I don't think it gains us anything. I feel we should receive the report, lock in the changes to the budgets, which except for one, I think, all go in the way of reduced expenses, improved operating surplus, and reduced capital expenditure, all of which obviously reduce what our level of debt is. So I feel number 4 does not serve any purpose. So I would certainly take 1 to 3, but I will oppose number 4.
Councillor Davey.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just have a couple of questions. In terms of the decrease in operating expenditures, on page, I just want to clarify what they are actually. Page 20, there's a delay in silt removal expenditure due to the regulatory approval process of 45k. And I just wondered what that meant. As well as on page 21 at 19.
Let's have one at a time, thank you.
Okay.
Yep. So the silt removal issue?
Yes. It's the first dot point on page 20, in the table on page 20.
And through the chair, there were some delays in receiving EPA approvals, and that's why the silt removal from Hazelwood Park was moved from this year to the next.
Thank you.
And your next one, Councillor Davis?
The other one is 57k efficiency savings from...
Page?
Page 21 at 19.2.2. Efficiency saving from in-house design and change in scope for the new playground project. I don't know what that is. Page 21. Can you remind us what that is?
$19.2.2.
19.2.2. It's called the new playground.
Through the chair, so we had some savings on one of our playground projects by using our internal landscape designer to design that up instead of using an external consultant. That was offset in our playground renewal budget, where we had one which went slightly over, so the net amount was a little bit less, and that was all spent on playgrounds. It was just distributed a little bit differently.
So there's no such thing as a new playground project. We have playground renewals going on. Is that, I think that's your point.
Yes, yes, that's,
Through the chair, no, we had one playground which was allocated under the new playground project, and I'd have to look back through my records to remember which one it was. It was either, I think it was it Pepper Street? I have to look back through my records to find out which one that was. With 4 playground projects this year. One was under the new, 3 under the renewal. The new one came out slightly under budget for these reasons. The renewal ones came out slightly over, but the net impact was not high.
Can you provide Councillor Davey with that specific information after the meeting? Thank you.
thanks. Thank you.
There's no further debate. Councillor Ford.
Thank you, Worship, and thank you for the comments. There's never a bad time at which to consider our financial situation and our debt. I think it's very important that we do that in an ongoing way. I do challenge the ratios that are put about, the debt to asset ratio and so on. I mean, the customary thing is to use the net financial liabilities ratio. And as I recall it, in the coming budget, it will reach 48%. And that is an extremely high level. And while it has been said on a previous topic that we perhaps should not compare ourselves with other councils, I really challenge that view that we, a council such as Burnside, a relatively small council, should have those sorts of debt projections with long-term debt being repaid over 20 years plus. I think at every opportunity we should review that. We are going to be paying out money over time in interest, and interest rates are unpredictable. They certainly never. I'll predict they will never be any lower than they are now, and the only way they will go is up. So I think at every opportunity we should really be reviewing our debt position. If we look at the third quarter report, we see on page 28 the decreased capital projects, new and upgrade expenditure adjustments and so on. So the very first one, there's $220,000 of savings achieved in a number of new and upgrade infrastructure projects. And one could go through it. Now, I realise some of these things are going to roll over into future years, but I believe that with some review, we would be readily capable of repaying $1 million off our long-term debt. I emphasise the long-term debt. And if not 1 million, then a substantial contribution, perhaps to a lesser amount. But unless we look, unless we test the system, we'll never know. And we go on in blissful ignorance of our increasing debt. And I urge you to support this analysis.
Thank you. I put the motion. All those in favour? Those against? The motion is lost. Division has been called by Councillor Ford. All those in favour, please stand. Those in favour are Councillors Monso, Bills, Lord and Ford. Those against are Councillors Osterstock, Lemon, Wilkins, Davis, Piggott, Davey and Cornish. Motion is lost, and I invite a councillor to run the officer's recommendation. Councillor Davis.
Yes, I'm happy to run the officer's recommendation.
A seconder of that, please. Councillor Davey. Any debate? I will put that motion. All those in favour? Against? That's carried. A division has been called on that matter. All those in favour, please stand. Those in favour being Councillors Osterstock, Lemon, Wilkins, Davis, Piggott, Davey and Cornish. Those against, Councillors Monso, Bills, Lord and Ford. The motion is carried. and I seek a recommendation that we have a 10-minute break. Moved Councillor Davis, seconded Councillor Davey. All those in favour? Against? That's carried. To recommence at 29:13. Thank you.
Did I get the call? We can resume. We got 6. Oh, sorry.
Okay, take seats, please. One, two, three, four. I seek a resolution that this meeting recommence.
I move that the meeting recommence.
Move Councillor Osterstock, seconded Councillor Piggott. All those in favour? Against? That's carried. Councillor Davis, you've pulled the matter of a partial waiver of encumbrance at 5 Wilson Court, Roslyn Park.
Thank you.
Page
I'd like to,
159 in your agenda papers.
yeah, I'd like to move the officer's recommendation, but I'd like to ask 2 questions in administration in relation to it.
Okay.
The first is, could you please tell me what the process was of what's happened in this and the development approval process and the big significant events, I suppose?
Through the chair, to boil it down to a reasonable nutshell, in this case, the DAP had granted approval for a 2-storey house on the property. Halfway through construction, we received complaints about the height of the building, and it did turn out that the building was being constructed too high. So we issued what we call a Section 84 notice, or a stop work notice, on the builder and the owner, which was complied with. The owner and builder then lodged an application to seek approval for the changes in the new design in retrospect, which the system allows. And ultimately, it's more complicated than this, but ultimately the parties involved in the legal appeal process, being the owner and 1 or 2 people to the rear that were agreed, came to an agreement. Yep. In relation to the new design, which was granted consent by the CAP. That's it in a nutshell. So there was, in the end, no formal punishment, but due to the circumstances, in this case, there was effectively some punishment. The owner lost 6 months and spent thousands of dollars on legal fees.
Good. And do we have any indication of how high they actually intended to build?
Excuse me, in the first place? Or?
Yeah, in the first place, before the stop work order was put in.
I haven't got the benefit of the report in front of me.
That's
I think
okay.
that's...
Can I also, so council actually holds an encumbrance at 8.5 metres over that property. If council were to take an action where they were to refuse the motion tonight and attempt to enforce the encumbrance, what would be our position there?
Through the chair, we received some legal advice on this matter. Going back to the beginning, the encumbrance it was brought in between the council at the time, and the developer of the land division to control certain aspects of design, and that was a common technique back in the 80s, either between developers and new purchasers, or between a council and developer, to ensure a certain standard of design. Back then, the development plan was a lot less sophisticated than it is now. So the issue of the appropriateness of the building has been discharged or dealt with through the planning process. But more critically, our advice is that the encumbrance, due to the way that's worded, is effectively not enforceable. The key aspect of that is that the encumbrance makes reference to subdivisional ground level and doesn't define subdivisional ground level. And despite interrogating the Land Titles Office, and even the very person that lodged the land division 30 years ago, there is no record of subdivisional ground level, so we would, quite frankly, have no hope at all of enforcing it.
Cool, thank you. I'll speak to the motion. So I think every councillor here has had problems with development throughout their term, and I think anybody can see that the area is fraught with issues. I'm told that it's perfectly acceptable in many cases for a developer to put in a plan, have it approved by it's called Council Assessment Panel, but I think it should probably be called State Assessment Panel. And then what happens is the developer intentionally can go and build above that. So they could go and build they get approved by the cap, they go and build to 9.5, and then the council says, well, hold on, it's too high, and it's already finished. Then what happens is if it goes to court, the court will say it's no longer talking about a 9.5 assessment anymore, it's now talking about a variation, and that's the thing, is that now it's only a variation of a certain amount. So, and the court is likely to approve it. So what that means is that this is a method that I understand is used and abused throughout this process, and it's a perfectly legitimate, and what you're doing is taking a risk, because if you go too high and you ask for too much, then they could say knock it down. But I think it would be a very brave court to say knock down your house there. And I don't think it happens very much, and I think developers are very aware and very conscious of what that limit is. So it's almost as if there's a game here. So the reason I've been following this one, and I think that particularly residents involved in this have felt completely unempowered, and they felt that this was the process that was being used and this was what was happening to them. And then they said, well, this isn't right. And I completely agreed with them. And they said, what can we do about it? And the answer is nothing. The answer is nothing. So what I wanted to consider last week, and the reason why I asked for an extension, was to consider whether the encumbrance could be used as a method to, because I understand the original application was 8.5 metres, which was right on the encumbrance level. That's what I recall. And now it's gone to 8 metres 75, so it's 25 mil. So if we did contest it, then they would say, oh, it's only a small amount. I think that's right. And so essentially, if we were to try and enforce this, it wouldn't go well for us, and our legal fees are not worth the trouble. But I did want to make a point and represent those residents who have expressed their concerns about how this has happened. And every time I touch a development matter, my confidence in the system is lowered and lowered and lowered, and we have absolutely no control over it. So I continue to be more and more distressed at it, and I think every resident I come to, I have to say there's nothing I can do to help you. And that's the unfortunate thing, is it's called a council assessment panel, and they come to us and they say, you're my council, you're my councillor, can you help me with this? And I say, no, go and talk to the state government. The state government says, go and talk to your council. And they're stuck in this loop where they have absolutely no recourse. And see, the thing is that historically, for example, in that area, it was all built at 8.5 metres, and I think that is an equitable approach. And they said, we're all going to comply with this because it's all in our best interests. They all could have gone to 10. They all could have initially built 10, and they all would have had sea views then. They would have been able to enjoy that as a development. But when this was originally sold to people buying in there, they say, oh no, there's an encumbrance. So your next door neighbour can't go and build higher than you, so you're all good. And this is a way of protecting it. Now, unfortunately, the fact that this development assessment panel's come in means that we can't enforce this essentially. And I think that whilst I'm disgusted by it and I'm incredibly disappointed, I'm moving with the officer's recommendation to approve the removal of the encumbrance because of the costs, and I don't think that it's worth doing. I don't think it's worth fighting or trying to enforce it, because my understanding is that we'll lose, and notwithstanding that is that we can't enforce it anyway, so they just don't need to comply with it, because we have no interest in the land really at the end of the day. I think that's a minute. So there are circumstances and something to consider in these developments like Glenunga where there is a managed authority, and that authority is the person then who owns the encumbrance and can enforce it. So that's actually, it won't happen in Glenunga, I don't think, but there are communities where they can say, these are the encumbrances, these are the standards, this is what you need to be held to, so in future they can be held to that. But unfortunately, that's not what happens here. So I move that the encumbrance be lifted, because I have no option, but I'd like to express that this whole arrangement with the DAP or the CAP is increasingly frustrating. I'm becoming increasingly disappointed with the process with every resident I talk to.
Yes, I will, but I'd also like to speak. I too, with great reluctance, will second this motion and the reluctance is for the very reasons that Councillor Davis has mentioned. I have been dealing, I don't know whether there's something in the water at the moment, but I've been dealing in the Glenunga area and Glenside with a number of people that have just ignored approved plans and ignored their development plans. And they haven't ignored them to a great degree, but they've ignored them enough to really annoy the neighbours badly. But I'd say two things, and I just think it's outrageous. And I'd say two things to that. The first thing I'd say is the majority of people that build in Burnside actually do it according to rule. We see the ones that don't. So I think we can take heart from the fact that most people do actually do the right thing. The second thing I'd say, and I think this is somewhere that we can actually have some influence, is this. The entire regulations for the new Planning Act and the Community Engagement Charter haven't actually progressed that far. We will have input into that, and I've already had chats with Magnus about saying if we do have input into what the plan is going to look like in Burnside, one of the things we should seriously start looking at is really making it hurt if someone goes beyond it. And when I say making it hurt, massive fines. You only have to hang one or two people at the crossroads and everyone will then comply. And I think it is within our remit to be able to raise this as an issue when the consultation comes round, when we start looking at new regulations and when we start looking at design codes, and it's at that level where we can do things like say, it's only going to be 8.5, no ifs, no buts, and we will review in 10 years. And then put in massive fines for those people that actually choose to go 10 centimetres over that. And I think that's the only recourse we've got, because Councillor Davis is quite right. Right now, it'll go to the ERD court and they rubber stamp everything. It's a variation, it's an amendment, and it's not fair to the people that do the right thing, and it's thumbing their nose at us.
Councillor Ford.
Thank you. It's a question, really. I understand the house there's no footings poured or it's not commenced at this stage.
Through the Chair, there is commencement.
Oh, okay.
And that very commencement led to our knowledge that it was being built too high.
Oh, and there had been no opportunity to excavate down, 10 inches to achieve the required height?
No, not in this case. The footings had been poured and a substantial amount of framework constructed, but they did have to redesign the building to accommodate the extra height, but probably not as much as they wanted in the end.
Councillor Davey.
Thank you, Worship. On principle, I won't be supporting the motion. I understand all of the rationales that have been put up, but I really can't see this. Having been up and viewed the site, it is not what we would call environmentally sustainable development, which complements the City of Burnside's character. I think you'd agree. It looks awful. I mean, it's been well established, well started, and I think it's a tilt-up isn't it? That's what it looks like. I don't think it enhances the reserve next to it, which, you know, mightn't have people on it. It would look awful from the reserve. It would look...
With respect, Councillor Davey, this is not about the design.
I know.
So
I'm still having my say.
And so there's not much point spending time on that. Let's keep on the subject.
Okay, I take your point. I take on board all of the comments that Councillor Lemon has just made, and I just hope that we can make our system, improve our system such that we have much more control over preventing such exploitation of our system. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Cornish.
Thank you, Mayor Packen. Yes, I'll support the motion, regrettably, like some of the others, but do note, obviously, the council plan and the differences with it and the history behind this particular encumbrance on this property. I will make point in, I love the sentiment of huge fines, but I'm also wary of them too, because that just means those that can afford to break the rules will. And, you know, a classic I remember reading many, many years ago in the paper was a gentleman in his roles would park anywhere in Adelaide because the parking fines were so cheap. He just didn't care. So, you know, I'd just be afraid that certain people with a lot of money behind them would just not care to get what they actually want and would pay the fine. So perhaps it's a percentage of their annual income that they have to pay instead as a fine. That might hit them a little bit harder. You know, I'm supporting the motion as it stands, and the sentiments around the disappointment in the development system that the state government's provided us.
Yes, I will make comment. I don't recall that this came to the CAP, am I right? Through you, Mr Mayor, to the manager. Didn't come to the CAP, did it not?
In the first instance, it was the DAP, but the amended plans did come to the CAP.
I don't recall it. Anyway, I just think it's another example, and I'm appalled that a company like Chase Crown would actually game the system to get an extra 250 mils. I mean, it's extraordinary. And I think we do need to keep a record of all of these instances so that when it comes to making consultation points and putting our side of the story on the record, we have instances. This happens time and time again, and it is not in our best interest.
Thank you. I was rung up by the bloke who lives on Mary Penfold Drive, to whom this place affects, and was taken into his spot and had a look from his kitchen. The house could be seen as a frame at that point, and he said, that's where the 8.75 is. That's fine, we're okay with that. They want to go higher. That extra 10 inches materially affects his view. Now, I know views aren't exclusive, but that's the whole point of an encumbrance. And if other people have to comply with it, so should this bloke. And the effect it has on this man now is and will be substantial. And I don't know who else went up there, who else was advised, but I certainly went there and viewed it. And so that's why I'm not going to support it. I think if we've got standards, doesn't matter how old they are, if we've got standards, we should maintain them. Otherwise, we're just a joke. In relation to councils not being ordered to pull anything down, I think you'll find they were. The ERD court last year ordered the Marion Council to pull down a house, I think it was a Merino, worth $1 million. So they will do it. But if we don't show any courage, nothing will happen. I know it's going to get up. It's wrong. I don't agree with it.
It is closed, but I will point out that this has been a rare opportunity for this chamber to vote on to discuss a matter of development. They don't normally come to us. It just happens that this encumbrance required our decision. It's a very rare debate we've been able to have. Councillor Davis, you may close the debate.
Yeah, I would like to make just a couple of points. In this particular issue, the residents were well informed of what a building's going to look like in terms of scaffolding and then the end result. So they knew, they had a good appreciation of what it was going to look like at the end, and they determined that I'd suggest potentially go much higher than the 25 mils that they've asked for. And potentially go much higher than that, but it was only the residents who, and these things are going to get built, and once they're built it's very difficult. So I appreciate that there has been a process there where they've had to stop work for 6 months with that order, but I think in many cases the building would go ahead and that order wouldn't be made, and it wouldn't have to come back, so it'd go through to the keeper. And yes, certainly they will order to pull things down, and I think we have other matters around that are potentially looking like that, but it's a risk, and it's a calculated risk. And if you can calculate how much you can get away with, then they will. So potentially what we could look at is having a naughty and nice list, and have a list of the developers who we know we can trust, and those that we potentially who like to play the game, and potentially go and have a look more strenuously and more frequently at those developments, or those people on the naughty list, and those on the nice list who play well and play within the rules, they should go off. But at the end of the day, my criticism is of the government, not this government, but the previous government. But it's something that we, not only as a council, but as an entire body of local government, because we've been humped with this, and I don't think we should be, because we don't have any say into the policy. If we have a policy document like paving, or if we have a policy document about parking, then that's us, and we can fix it. But it's completely unfair for us to be responsible for it, but then also have to, we be responsible for it, but have absolutely no say over the policy. And that's my big criticism of this. So I'll leave it there. But I think that the residents are happy that that their concerns have been expressed, and hopefully we can, I don't think we can prevent it in future, and that's been my answer every time. So I'm a bit dismayed, and perhaps we can have a conversation about that as to what we can do. Thank you.
Thank you. I put the motion. All those in favour? Those against? Motion's carried. Councillor Piggott, Macbeth Drive, Skye, page 177.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd like to run the officer's recommendation, but put a 7th point at the end, if I may. And that 7th item should read that Council reaffirms its intention to maintain the closure of Kensington Road at its eastern end. Look, not much to do here, I don't think, really. I mean, talking to the motion, the report talks about the situation of the application for private residents to go on the northern face of that area up there. It's the road area there comes into the back of the 100 Years of Anzac site, and is the eastern end of Kensington Road. And in fact, number 7 perhaps doesn't do very much more than what has already been done. I think from my reading of it that it's quite clear to all parties that there is no intention that the road would be open to this end of those properties and the road reserve that we are now sorting out with both Boral and with Adelaide Hills Council. But I just felt it was worth reaffirming to perhaps all the parties, particularly Boral, I guess, in terms of the sale of the properties, and the fact that whoever does take those properties on, or take those, the land on and develops on them, that it's not an intention of this council that they would have a direct path into the city coming this way. And so, apart from that, it's actually a really, as you read in the report, it was quite a confused area of the council, and in fact, there's been quite a lot of work done here, I think, and it all makes a lot of sense. So, I feel we should pass this motion with the addition of just reaffirming the closure of Kensington Road.
Do you wish to speak to the matter? Anyone else wish to speak to the matter? Councillor Burnside?
Just a question.
Yes.
Is this land within the Hills Face zone? It is?
Yes.
Therefore, subdivision is limited? Yeah, they've got 3 blocks and that's allowed, that's all that's allowed. Okay, thank you.
Oh, Councillor Rochester.
Thank you. What's the current status with Borrell and the runoff that occurs from their mine into Second Creek, I think it is? What's the status with that issue?
Through your worship, we contacted Borrell today for another reason and advised that the additional wells or areas that they were installing to catch the additional runoff water within the mine itself have been put in place, and they just have to lay some final pipes for the project to be complete and tested, and they expect that to be done by the end of June, and they will then extend an invitation to elected members to visit in July to come up and see it for themselves.
So it's a retention dam of some sort, is it?
Yes, there's approximately 4 or 5. Can you recall when we visited? One big one, and then a few smaller ones throughout the site, starting at the top, working its way down.
And they are specifically for prevention of silt runoff into Second Creek. They don't also double as water storage for their operations on site, do they?
Through your worship, I'm only going off of what we were told when we visited them on site, and it was to capture the water on site to stop it going down during heavy periods. Depending on the amount of water in each of them and pending weather forecasts or heavy period of rain, they may look to lessen some of the balance to be able to cope with additional flows. But what they do with that water, I'm not privy to.
It has to go somewhere, doesn't it?
You'd have to make it very clear why this is relevant to the current matter, Councillor Rochester.
Well, it's an application from Borrell. They're
That's where it ends.
a responsible, I would think, community member. They're seeking action. No, it's not working. They're seeking this council to action a request on their behalf, and I think it is more than relevant to determine the latest status on a significant environmental issue that confronts this city in times of heavy rain with silt runoff into Second Creek. I think it's very relevant.
Davis, you have a question?
Yeah, look, very, very briefly. I'm following this issue hotly with silt, and I understand that it's they'll finish their pipes in.
You have no question. Thank you.
And notice I'm talking to it.
No.
I'm saying it's completely irrelevant, and I'll be all over it. So
you're speaking to the motion?
Yeah, I'm speaking to the motion that we shouldn't make any kind of decision on this based on what they're doing with the silt. I think they are separate, and rest assured that I've got an eagle eye on their silt management and their ponds, which they will use for operational purposes, which is okay, but we'll come back to that.
Closed. Councillor Piggott, may I put the motion? I put the motion. All those in favour? Those against? Motion's carried. And finally, in this sector, Councillor Lemon, you have pulled the matter of the Conningham Street Master Plan, page 197.
Thank you, Your Worship. It's with great pleasure that I move the motion as stated with the officer's recommendation. We are finally, after many years, at this point where we have a master plan and a project plan that we're about to sign off on. And I think it's very exciting. I think it's very exciting in the sense that because of community consultation, we have massive support from the local community for what this master plan looks like. this particular facility is going to be as well utilised, I believe, as Glenunga Hub is. It is a wonderful use of what is currently an underutilised piece of land, and I thank administration for the work that they've done. In particular, I think it is excellent work to have been in touch with Unley Council to seek collaboration for a second men's shed for this area with the Unley people. In particular, I think that going ahead with this project is likely to give us some Lions Club funding, which was offered some time ago, and may well give us more. In particular, there are other things that are going to be looked at in seeking other sources of funding. And I won't go on too much, but the plan itself has taken, there's been a lot of care taken in making it environmentally sound, in making it carbon neutral, in making it water sensitive, in making it the best it can be, and at a reasonable price. So I'm very proud of this, and I'm very happy to move this officer's recommendation.
Thank you. I seek a seconder. Councillor Wilkins, you...
Thank you, Your Worship. I too am very happy to move that we do support this officer's recommendation, considering that it was first mooted in early 2003 in a former council. It is actually going to be in an amazing space because 84% of people who were consulted actually agree with this, and it is the centre of the retirement area in our particular ward in Burnside, Eastwood and Glenunga. I'm pleased that we have increased the car parks and we have actually increased the space, and it has a considerable number of environmentally sustainable design features, including the solar array on the roof, the glazing, the insulation, the rainwater tanks that are going to harvest rainwater, etc., etc. And I can absolutely agree that it will be well used and supported. It's not the first thing that's been supported by Unley Council in this particular ward. Eastwood Community Centre has worked previously with Unley Council with their community programs, and this is just a new community program that hopefully they will come on board with. And I think in years to come, the well-being of mature-aged men and other persons in the community will need a centre like this more than ever. There is so much need out there in the retired group for a space for people to go, feel secured, socialise and actually be creative, and this offers a variety of opportunities because we're all going that way, getting older and older. So I totally support this program. I think it'll be great. I think there's creative opportunities for funding that could come along in the next 12 months. So it will be well supported, and I thank the staff for the work that they've done over the past couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Davey.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have an amendment I wish to make, and that is at everything the same, and that at 2, after the Conningham Street Depot site, add as a carbon neutral facility in capitals. Thanks.
Before I accept that, I need to understand for the administration what that means, and is it possible?
I want it to be zero waste.
Through
zero.
the Mayor, at
Beautifully.
this point in time,
State-of-the-art.
the scheme has been designed to minimise carbon emissions, but it isn't carbon neutral. And
Why not?
the amendment was technically incorrect because we cannot at this point in time guarantee its carbon neutrality.
But you're advising us that to the greatest extent possible, you're minimising its carbon footprint.
Yes, we are.
With current technology.
That's correct, but that amendment to the motion is beyond the power of the council because we cannot guarantee that at this point in time.
So on the basis of which is a term I love, I cannot accept that.
Can I have a say? As far as possible as a carbon neutral facility? I'd be happy to amend that.
That would be fine, and my understanding is that's the case.
Yes.
So if it, as far as
a carbon neutral facility?
as far as practically possible,
Well, just as far as possible.
well, far as possible could cost millions of dollars. It's possible,
Well,
but
we've
it's
just
not
heard
practical.
that it is already a carbon neutral.
No, we haven't. We haven't said that. We've said we are doing the best as we practically can.
As far as possible as a carbon neutral facility. I think that's
I don't. I'm not going to quibble over that.
Thank you. I mean, my aim is to have a state-of-the-art, I mean, I think this is a wonderful opportunity. I thank the staff for all of the work they've done on it and the modifications they've made, even as late as most recently with all the new legislation to include a dog house so that we've got somewhere to store stray dogs. But I think this is a wonderful opportunity for us to have the gold standard in development in an area where we have got our men's shed, a nursery, a depot store, garden store, all of these, we're building it from scratch. So we really should be able to make a carbon neutral facility. We've got all these problems with waste production and waste recycling. We want to have zero waste on site and construct it accordingly and make it a feature of Burnside. I don't see that that's not possible. So I hope that you'll support this and that this can be added and aimed at. We're going to be aiming for funding to achieve our objectives. I think this will be a way of selling it to achieve that optimal funding. Thanks.
Well, the motion's in play. I seek a seconder for that. For the amendment's in play, I seek a seconder for that amendment. There being none, the amendment lapses, and I seek further debate. Councillor Piggott.
Oh, I must.
Right, that's right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, I'm excited by this project as well. I think it is a good plan for making what is an underutilised site and perhaps a bit of embarrassment to the city something that's much more functional and something we're more proud of. I do, however, believe that we should be doing a couple of things before we finally press the button on it. And if I can explain what I mean there, I feel we should adopt the plan. I think the plan works. It's had a lot of work on it, and it does work. I feel we should adopt that plan. However, I don't feel that we should go headlong into full funding in this project until we've sorted a couple of other things out that tie into this. And the first one of that is Laurel Avenue. Clearly, part of this is Laurel Avenue, is moving of the nursery facilities in Laurel Avenue. And it needs to be, I feel it needs to be done at the same time. I feel that we could be down the track, having spent a couple of $1 million of putting nursery facilities into Conningham Street, and then asking the community, what do we do with this piece of land that we used to use, and not getting support to actually change its status and ultimately dispose of it. That would mean that we would potentially have a significant asset that would be of very little value to us because we couldn't do anything with it and we couldn't actually get support for selling it. What this project does is actually allow that a really positive reason why that is a good thing to do in regard to Laurel Avenue. So I feel we should do that first. We should do that before we start on Conningham Avenue. Second is that it locks us in on men's sheds, and actually I'm in favour of that. If the debate here was whether in 2020, if the Fed stop supporting men's sheds, whether that is something that we would seek to step in and maintain them, I would be highly supportive of it. The fact is we haven't had that debate yet, and I think we do need that debate before we start building a men's shed that perhaps in 2 years won't have funding. That's something we need to do as well. The third, which is in the motion around the potential funding from other areas, that I think we need to do a bit more work on too. So I actually feel, looking at it, is where we're at here is that the site needs to be remediated. It's contaminated. It's the report tells us that it's actually worth significantly more if it had been remediated. We are most likely to push down the track in regard to doing this, so it'll need to be remediated, and I'm up for doing that straight away. I don't see any downsides in that. It shows the community that we have ticked this project off and we have started down that track. And it does give us a bit of time to sort the other issues out. So my view here is that I'm totally supportive of the project. I just don't think we have got all the ducks in a row quite yet to press the button on $2 million. I feel what we should do, and I would put an alternative motion if this was unsuccessful, that did adopt the design that we've been presented and has been the subject of a lot of work, does push the button on remediating the site, and then ask for council to commence the process of talking to the community about maintaining the plant nursery, but in Conningham Street, and then changing the status of Laurel Avenue, so in actual fact the council could sell it to the benefit of the ratepayers. It also allows us to really look at the men's shed argument. I doubt that will be an onerous issue, but that also could be sorted so that at least when we do build this men's shed, it has got a certain future beyond when the federal government may or may not stop supporting it. And it does allow us, I think, with council approval that this is what we want to do and all the elements in it, it does allow council, I think, to actually look at potential partners in it or areas where we may get funding. So I don't want to stop this, quite the opposite, but I think as a responsible council we need to get all those things done before we finally go down the path of writing out the cheque to make it happen. So from that point of view, I feel we should vote this down and put in an alternative motion.
There are no further speakers, so Councillor... No one's pressed any buttons.
Yes, I have.
Councillor Bills, you have now.
Thank you. It's an interesting site and lots of interesting proposals, and I do note that it was overwhelmingly endorsed by 84%. That is 84% of 144 respondents out of the 5,300 which were sent out. It's not a glowing endorsement. Let's not get carried away. When this came up last year, I raised the issue of contamination at that site, and it was at the stage where Glenside was being absolutely bloody destroyed. And they were using the issue of PAH, which are polyaromatic hydrocarbons, as their reason for doing the remediation at Glenside and destroying 300 trees. I raised that issue, and it's not covered in this report. But what is covered is the fact, the thing Grant's alluded to, that there is remediation needed, and a figure of $220,000 before you even start to look at anything could be expended. There's a lot of things about it I don't like. There's a lot of things about it I do like. I concede that being a member of the men's shed, it's got some benefits, and the place we've got now does have limitations. But looking at this plan, so is this. It's not as convenient as where we are. It doesn't have the car parking, and out of the 6 groups that attend the men's shed, 1 has mental and physical disabilities, and that requires some additional care in relation to car parking. I know we've got 15, but if you've got the nursery running as well, and you've got people from the depot rattling around in their little four-wheel drives and front-end loaders, they're going to have to find somewhere to park. There's not ample parking on this place. It's really not convenient from that regard. And if we do have a community garden, which is another thing that gets me a little bit, Eastwood will have 2 of them. I haven't got one. 3 other wards don't have one. Seems a bit unfair that they might get 2. And if they're working, a community garden has to have an overseer. So that's additional cost to council and another car parking spot. So where's that going to occur? I have reservations about the plan, and to look at the workshop, the men's shed, for instance, we can access the toilets by walking through the kitchen. I don't think that's particularly sanitary, and it probably wouldn't exist in too many other places. The fact that we've got suggestion of a nursery moving down to that location, to me, is just odd. And I've had arboricultural friends of mine and nursery people say that moving it into an area which has got noxious chemical next to a noxious chemical store, it's been a depot and containing all sorts of nasties for the past 40 years. It's a mechanical workshop and it's right next door to a petrol station on 2 major roads. It's the worst place to have a nursery, which at the current stage in Laurel Avenue is renowned as being one of the cleanest nursery sites in metropolitan Adelaide, absolutely uncontaminated. And even Mark Ellis will testify to that fact, that it's a good place to grow plants. We did community consultation. Well, a petition was done when we had an open day at Laurel Avenue, and quite a number of signatures, I think in excess of 300, were gained by people wanting Laurel Avenue to stay where it was. In 2010, we said to the people, we're going to put a community garden at Laurel Avenue. It never happened. Laurel Avenue workers don't even have a toilet. How badly are we treating them? And using that as a reason to justify getting rid of it and then going down to Conningham Street is just illogical and unfair. Car parking is the issue. If you're going to do Conningham Street, then you really shouldn't have that community garden there. You should be for car parks. We've had enough issues with car parking. As a responsible council, if we're going to do something, we should not be placing any people who use that location in a situation where they're going to be impacting on residential streets. The current situation with the men's shed, the nursery, they will be parking on Conningham Street, and that is a bad representation of Burnside Council's respect for residents. I'm going to vote against it. I think it needs some more work. I certainly appreciate the work that's been done. I think it's gone a long way, but it's still got some way to go. It's and flogging off Laurel Avenue just does not seem appropriate to me. If anything, we should be doing something there, maybe putting a men's shed at that location.
Thank you, Councillor Bills. This issue is not about what we do with Laurel Avenue, it's a separate issue. Councillor, I just noticed it's 10 o'clock. I seek a motion, a recommendation that we, if necessary, move to 10:30. Moved Councillor Davis, seconded Councillor Ford. All those in favour? Against? That's carried. I'm on too early. Okay, well, that's excellent. We might get over earlier. Councillor Davis.
Yeah, I disagree that it's unrelated to Laurel, because what we're doing is we're looking at where we're going to have a nursery. So I think it definitely is related. But I suppose, look, just in relation to the number of people who came back on this, if the number of people who responded is a fraction, then the number of people who did out the petition is 2 fractions. So my view is different. I think that their assessment and their views are valid, and they're the people who wanted to comment on it. And so they provided us with that, and their view is that this is a very good plan to put there. And I certainly agree with them. And I think that we should do both. I think we should start to consider, if the idea is that now Laurel Avenue has become, if we push on with this, and I think we should accept this tonight, and I think this should go through and we should commence work on it, because I think that this is a very good plan forward. Once we start work on this and we start looking at funding, it may well be the case that we now need to look at Laurel and see whether it's now superfluous, and considering what we can do there in whatever shape, whatever form it is. But I think that the plan for Conningham Street is very well developed and takes care of a number of services that this council needs. And in terms of the community gardens, I mean, we have one, but just because there's already one in your ward doesn't mean that we shouldn't have another one. I think it's a great idea to have a community garden there. So look, I believe that we should move forward with this project. I think we should certainly do as Councillor Piggott suggests, is now start looking at Laurel to see whether it's surplus to our needs, whether something else should go there. And we should do that essentially immediately if we now determine that that site is no longer necessary or what we should be doing there. But I think that we should push forward with this and start talking about funding and seeking funding for it, because I think it is an excellent initiative, something that we have progressed over a very, very long time and that this council has worked hard to produce. So I think we should move forward with it. Thank you.
Bonso.
Yes, look, I still have some issues in relation, and on this rare occasion I actually do support Councillor Piggott. Because I think there are some unresolved issues here. I don't see a need for a community garden. Within Pineview across the road, they have their own little community garden. They have certainly not expressed the need to have an additional space. Whereas, as Councillor Bills has said, there's no community garden in that part of, in Linden Park or in that area. There's the nearest one is McGill. So there is potentially a need for that. And I'm not convinced that moving the nursery site to Conningham is a necessity, but I do agree with Councillor Bills that they cannot operate the way they are now with no toilet except walking across to the reserve. And without the facilities that they certainly do not have there. So I think there are some unresolved issues. I think there should be. I think the report is excellent. I really particularly appreciate the connection between what is proposed and the strategic plan, because I think they all actually fit in with exactly one of the things that I'm on about all the time, and that is public health. And they're because all these issues have to do with the healthy environment and healthy people, feeling good about themselves, having a place to go. I'm particularly concerned about parking, because I do know the issues some of the issues related to the men's shed and parking and access, particularly for disability access. And one car park for disability, not enough in this day and age, not enough out of 15. Because just because someone's disabled doesn't mean to say they're not driving a car, or maybe in a wheelchair, and the idea of having to go wheeling their way through the kitchen in order to go to the toilet is not exactly a clever idea. So there are a number of issues in terms, I think in principle it's great, but I do think there are some issues that need to be resolved before we go ahead and endorse this totally. But certainly the most important thing is the remedial work on the land, on the site, and improving the look of the site for everyone who drives down Conningham Street. The other issue is there is a bicycle lane in Conningham Street, and there would have to be some decisions about the bicycle lane where it starts and finishes, because if you put additional parking right outside this site, they would be parking in what is currently a bicycle lane. The Mayor knows all about that one.
Duck. Councillor Osserstock.
Thank you. Through you, Mr Mayor, the plans that have been provided, do they comply with disability legislation?
Through your worship, yes.
The plans that are provided, do they comply with the council's parking policy in respect to any development of this nature? The number of car parks that have been proposed.
Through your worship, that would be subject to going through the appropriate planning approvals, but we've had advice to say that they would be fine.
Is there any wrong with the council having two nurseries? Anything wrong with that?
If council chose to have two nurseries, no, that would be fine.
Anything wrong with the council having two men's sheds? Or three, or four?
Through your worship, same response. No.
Thank you. Nothing wrong with it. This plan has been 8 years in the making. When I was first elected in 2010, it was one of the first items on the agenda. It's now 8 years later. We have an excellent plan. that complies with disability legislation, that complies with parking regulations. Nothing wrong with having 2 men's sheds, nothing wrong with having 2 nurseries. I can't see anything wrong with it, quite frankly. Yes, we're going to have to spend some money on remediating the site. Remediation on sites goes on all the time with any large-scale development. It's gone out for community consultation. Over 5,000 people were consulted. Of those that chose to respond, I look at it as those that didn't endorse the plan. Otherwise, they would have complained that it was no good. They didn't. They were mute. Of those that chose to respond, that were excited by the plan, 84% endorsed the plan. That's the result of the community consultation. I think the council should endorse it. I'll be supporting the motion.
Thank you. And Councillor Ford.
Thank you, Worship. I too would like to see development at this site, and I'm very supportive of the men's shed proposal. I'm also very supportive of maintaining a depot for the council at that site. But now, having seen the plans and the layout, I am concerned that we are trying to put too much onto that site. And I think the issues raised, although by Councillor Bills about parking, I mean, it certainly may pass official tests and so on, but or regulatory tests, but does it pass the common sense test? I'm not sure that it does. I mean, for example, if 30 people turn up at the men's shed, which I think would be, not unexpected, a couple of council people are there as well, some other people tending the nursery and the like, I don't think that the car parking will prove adequate. On the other hand, if the nursery wasn't located there, then I think we would have ample space for what is proposed. And I do think that the Laurel Street nursery has some exclusive benefits that would not translocate to the Conningham Street area. And if we could also save some expenditure on this site, on external works, for example, then we could look at some modest resources being applied to Laurel Avenue and continuing that in its very important function. So I'm with Councillor Piggott. I think we need to move in a stepwise process here. I do think we need some reconsideration, and I'm not in favour of the motion as it stands.
Thank you, Mayor Parkin. I will be supporting the motion as it stands. I've been listening to quite a lot of the debate. The positioning of a toilet and having to access it through a kitchen. A lot of people do that at home, so I don't know what the big issue about that is. Laurel Avenue, certainly it's in consideration, and I think that can be decided at a later date. I certainly know when we were replanting all the trees down Alexandra and Prescott, we were actually paying a third party to house all our mature trees and look after them because we didn't have enough site. So, there are potentially other options to be using that could actually save us a lot of money through external contractors housing mature trees that need to be planted around the city at certain times. Community gardens certainly was raised as well, and look, I go on a needs basis, and that goes down to housing density. We've got 4-storey retirement villages down there in Glenside. We've got 6 to 8-storey buildings that are going to go in the old hospital site in apartments. Some of those people are actually going to like a little bit of garden space and to turn over some soil and plant some peas and some all those sort of aspects. So I do look at the housing density and where community gardens are certainly more required than areas that have a lot of yard space where people have got the ability to actually plant their own stuff in their own yards. And that's why I think certainly Eastwood and Glenside definitely are deserving of certainly 2 community gardens in that area. So they're the sort of the reasons why I'm sort of supporting it. I've been listening to some of the arguments. We have debated this particular project for quite some time. We've gone out to community consultation. It's about time to pull the lever. So I will be supporting this motion as it stands.
Councillor Piggott, you got a question?
Oh, a couple actually. Just following up on Councillor Osterstock's questions. I just wondered, through you, Mr. Mayor, is it legal to provide more disabled parks than what is required under the standard?
I imagine it probably is.
Probably is. Does the council, in administration's opinion, need 2 nurseries?
Through your worship, this has been designed to accommodate the nursery needs of the city. So one would be sufficient.
Thank you.
Thank you. Debate's over. Councillor Lemon.
Thank you, and thank you all for your comments. I'm dismayed to have Laurel Avenue twinned with this site. They are separate issues, and I think we need to look at them as separate issues. Laurel Avenue is a site that is currently a biodiversity nursery and will be for at least another 12 months, if not longer. And when the time comes, and it may or may no longer be used for that purpose, and that's not for us to say tonight at all. If that time comes, then there will be a debate about Laurel Avenue. But tonight's not the night for that. Tonight's the night for actually, as Peter says, pulling the lever on this one. I draw your attention to page 201, under traffic and car parking, where car parking as a particular issue has been raised by several councillors tonight. What I can say, having been involved with my co-councillor Wilkins, is this. As we've gone through the process of refining this design, administration have gone backwards and forwards to accommodate the very best outcomes, taking into account there will be frail and elderly men. Taking that into account, and it actually says that in paragraph 13. It takes the car parking into account. They've rejigged the whole thing so that Big Plant can still turn around in the depot part of it, and as many car parks as possible in the right places that aren't going to run over people have been put in there. There's been an enormous amount of work taking that stuff into account. To say that this place shouldn't have a community garden because there's another one in Eastwood is outrageous. We all had the opportunity over years to have that comment, to say that when we've had preliminary plans brought to us, to actually bring that in now as we're about to pull the lever on this plan and say, oh, well, I don't think there should be a community garden because there's not enough room for it. What was wrong with saying this time last year? Why does this have to be done now, at the last minute? This plan works really well. And in terms of the men's shed, yes, let's have 2 men's sheds. There's nothing wrong with having 2 men's sheds. Funding from the Commonwealth is actually going to be is been extended to 2020, and then there will be a provider model where the recipients of those grants choose the service they want. If we've got a men's shed working really well by 2020 on this site, there'll be a lineup of people wanting to actually have Commonwealth funding for the services that get provided out of this men's shed. There may well be a lineup for people in the men's shed we've already got in Kensington. I don't know, and we won't know unless we pull the lever tonight. These contingencies that we're talking about, that have been talked about tonight, what are we going to do with the men's shed? Well, we're not going to do anything with the men's shed. We're building another men's shed. And when the decision comes in 2020, if there's no funding, then we make a decision about what's going to happen with the other men's shed. We're not going to do anything with Laurel Avenue because Laurel Avenue should not and must not be contingent on this project. Laurel Avenue is something that will be looked at separately, and that nursery must continue in the interim before it's looked at, before we see it as anything else, but it's got nothing to do with this site. I hope you support this. This is a project that should be sitting separately. It is in an area of high density that will become even denser with another 1,000 dwellings about to be built over the next 10 years. Not only do we have Pineview across the road, but we also have Amber Woods and we have Glenbrook. So a community garden will be very welcome in that site with lots of elderly people. So please support this. It's been a long time coming and tonight's the night.
Thank you. I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Those against? Motion is carried. The vision has been called by Councillor Osterstock. All those in favour, please stand. Those in favour are Councillors Osterstock, Lemon, Wilkins, Davis, Lord and Cornish. Those against are Councillors Monceau, Bills, Piggott, Davey and Ford. The motion is carried. Item 15 on our agenda for subsidiaries and regional subsidiaries. Only thing in there is the minutes of a special board meeting, which is on page 239, and the recommendation is those minutes be received. I have a motion to that effect, please. Move Councillor Osterstock. Seconded Councillor Piggott. All those in favour? Against? That's carried. There is no other items on the agenda. Are there any other business? There being Councillor Cornish.
I just wish to wish Matthew Spearman a very happy birthday for today.
Thank you. Was there any other business?
There was. Perhaps you should
won't
ask
speak
me
that.
first, Mr. Mayor. No, I just wanted to, and perhaps it might have been a question without notice earlier, but in terms of, in regard to the deputation from the gardeners, in terms of what happens next in regard to that, normally there's no specific motion or issue in front of council, which normally does happen. So I just want to know what's the next step there?
Well, I would imagine that there is no next step unless the administration wishes to take its own initiative on the matter. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. CEO, thank you.
Through you, Mayor, we distributed information today to all of you via Robert, so that gives you a state of play. So if the deputation has caused you to believe that the decision was incorrect, a rescission motion is required because council has already resolved, and we are following council's resolution with respect to that.
Could I just clarify? It's not necessarily that. It's just purely there were questions unanswered in my mind after the deputation, which normally we would have been able to flesh out when we debated a specific motion. So I thank you for your answer.
Through the Mayor, we can provide a supplementary information document to you, taking on board what was said. We have it recorded, and we can provide administrative responses to those statements.
I think that would be a really good idea for people to all know exactly the status and exactly what was the truth and untruth that were told tonight by that.
Thank you.
Is it likely that the tree will be removed?
Through the Mayor, no. We believe that there's no need for the removal of the tree whatsoever. A bit of judicious pruning. However, other matters were introduced into the argument about why it required to be so heavily pruned, and arguments such as the colour of the courts, etc. So it wasn't clear from the deputation tonight that all the information was provided. So we're happy to provide you with an information document that clears it up.
Taylor meeting closed at 10:21 p.m. and thank you for your attendance.